Mute your line.
Hello, everyone. My name is Debbie Fox. I'm with the National Network to End Domestic Violence and a part of the DV and Housing Technical Assistance Consortium with Collaborative Solutions, the National Alliance for Safe Housing, and the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence. I'm very pleased to welcome you to our coordinated entry, Supporting DV Survivors, and an innovative Emerging Best Practices webinar series today on May 10, 2018, with Multnomah County in Oregon. An implementation process for their DV parallel housing system in their jurisdiction. Also joining us on the call in the chat box during the Q&A portion of the webinar is Chris Bilhart and Jenny Herget from the National Alliance for Safe Housing and Emily Reamer from Collaborative Solutions. The goal of the DV and Housing Technical Assistance Consortium Coordinated Entry Series is to highlight what bubbles up from the field and what we are hearing works to share with you all. There is no one right way to roll out coordinated entry, and we encourage you to take the ideas shared here today to inspire you and keep you moving forward with creating or improving the survivor-centered procedures in your communities. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Maria Lamb to begin our coordinated entry webinar.
Hi, Maria. You may be muted, so if you want to hit *6 or #6 to unmute yourself, that would be great.
Now? We're on. Go for it, Maria.
Okay, so have you heard anything yet?
Nope.
Okay, so we'll start all over. We were just thanking you for joining us and that we're happy to be here to share some of the things that we've learned about coordinated access to housing resources. I'm joined here by some other folks in our community. I'll let Maria introduce herself.
Hello, everyone. My name is Maria Alvarez. I am the Domestic Violence Program Specialist here at the Joint Office of Homeless Services. And kind of in a nutshell, what I do is support our housing and shelter providers that do victim service work in our community.
And my name is Abby Gassama, and I am the Domestic Violence Program Manager at the Native American Youth and Family Center in Portland, Oregon.
And my name is Martha Strawn-Morris, and I run our jurisdiction's drop-in center that co-locates 15 different agencies, all focused on serving survivors of domestic violence and their children. But I also was the facilitator of the collaborative process to design what we call coordinated access.
All right. So I'm just going to give you a little overview about what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about our local COC housing system. We know that every community is a little different, and understanding that context is an important part of figuring out how survivors can best access housing support. Then we'll talk a little bit about our local DV system. It says DV system there, but really we're just talking about the housing components of the system. We'll jump into what we're all here to talk about, coordinated access. We'll talk about how Multnomah County DV providers approach the challenge of responding to the charge of coordinated access, and some of the processes and protocols we've developed along the way. We'll wrap up with a little bit about where we are today and some of the lessons we've learned along the way and continue to learn pretty much every day. Please ask questions along the way. We're in the trusty hands of Chris and Debbie, and I'm sure they'll keep us on track. So let's start with, where is this place, Multnomah County? We're right on the northern border of Oregon. Just across the Columbia River is the lovely Vancouver, Washington. What? That's not what you're seeing. Can you all see the slides okay? Hello?
There it is.
Is it there? Okay. Sorry about that. Technical issues abound. So we are Multnomah County, right on the border between Washington and Oregon. We have a population of about 799,000 people, the largest population in Oregon, and also we're the smallest county geographically. As you probably guessed, Portland is our largest city, but there are 5 other cities in our county, including the 4th largest city in Oregon, Gresham. Portland, like a lot of other cities, but also in its own unique way, has changed and grown over the last few years, and specifically in relation to what we're talking about today, the housing market has boomed here over the last few years, which is good for some people, but as we know, harshly impacts the most vulnerable, which includes many survivors who are fleeing domestic violence, and disproportionately impacts people of color. And the rapidly increasing rent and a serious lack of affordable housing creates vulnerability in people who may have been able to get back on their feet in a more reasonable housing market. All of that comes into play as we seek housing solutions for survivors in our community. And I'm going to turn it over to Maria Alvarez to talk about our local housing system.
Thank you. So I'm just going to do a fairly general overview of what our local housing system looks like. And so in 2013, we established what we call a home for everyone, which is the initiative, essentially our local COC, or continuum of care. And this was the first time that we truly had a community-wide effort geared towards addressing and quote-unquote solving homelessness. Not to say that it hadn't been done before, but this was the first time that we had a joint collaboration from the City of Portland, the City of Gresham, Multnomah County, the local housing authority, so Home Forward, our community partners and nonprofits, faith-based leaders, and a bunch of other people. Essentially, it was a bunch of stakeholders that comprise what we now call a home for everyone. And so in 2015, we declared here in Multnomah County a housing state of emergency. And so, it became clear that the number of folks experiencing homelessness was increasing in Multnomah County, and at the same rate, affordable housing was decreasing. And so it became a pretty big issue that we recognized we needed to address. And so that came with a number of new investments coming from both the city and the county as one to try to help address homelessness in our community. And so one of the things that a Home for Everyone did was create what we call now the Joint Office of Homeless Services, which is essentially, well, as it's called, an office that was meant to institutionalize the work that was being brought forward by a Home for Everyone and all of these stakeholders that were involved in this new plan to help address homelessness. And so one interesting thing about the Joint Office is that we centralize essentially all of the resources coming from the city and the county and essentially developed a unified vision, and we all had a shared goal together. And so in the context of domestic violence, this was a big deal because it was the first time that DV was really brought to the table as one of those main voices in addressing homelessness in our community. And so when the Joint Office was created, we specifically had dedicated FTE for the first time to help support the housing and shelter services within our domestic violence system. And just kind of as an interesting conversation that I had recently, in preparing for this presentation, I spoke to Mark Jolin, who's the director of the Joint Office, and I essentially asked him, what really led to us having such a prominent voice in this work for the DV system to finally be recognized at the same rate that all of these other subpopulations were. So, and by subpopulations, I mean youth, families with children and single adults without children, and now domestic violence. And so he said it pretty straightforward. The reason why we are where we are today is because of the level of advocacy that happened on behalf of the service providers and on behalf of leadership that was doing domestic violence work. He put it pretty simply, which was the DV system kept showing up at the table. They made it clear that they were already doing the work of providing housing resources for folks experiencing homelessness, that is to say survivors fleeing domestic violence, that we were doing that work and that we deserved to be a part of those conversations moving forward. And so this was something that A Home for Everyone recognized, and essentially they said, how can we institutionalize this so that your voice stays at the table moving forward? And so that is, again, when the Joint Office was created, and dedicating a full FTE to help support the domestic violence system, they were essentially saying, you know, we hear you and we want you to be a part of this table. And that could not have been accomplished had it not been by the folks who kept showing up. And interestingly enough, we have some of those folks at the table. Debbie Fox was a huge person in that movement, as was Maria Lamb and Martha and everyone in this room. But it's pretty exciting stuff. So not only showing that we were doing this work already, I'm going to move on to the next slide. Do you have that one up? Yep. Okay, perfect. So again, in being able to show kind of the level of work and how well we were doing this, it didn't come out of nowhere. This all started because we did have some local resources for housing in our system. But as you can tell, and you'll notice on the slide, this is kind of what we had started with before we fully implemented and created our coordinated entry process for survivors. But you can see that what we had was 12 providers, some of which were standalone domestic violence or victim service providers, and some of which were just subset programs of broader organizations, perhaps mainstream organizations that had a culturally specific domestic violence program, or perhaps culturally specific agencies that had a domestic violence subset within their greater organization. We also at that time had what we called the DV pool, which was essentially some housing resources that all of the agencies would have equal access to, in hopes of being able to use that to place their participants into housing. This was kind of one of those few or first examples of how DV advocates, folks who are specialized in domestic violence work, were able to do that housing piece, that they didn't have to be separate, that you can have an advocate who specializes in housing and domestic violence to get folks housed. So that first pool was kind of the first time that we were able to show to the greater homeless system that we can do this work and we know how to do it, and we are actually better suited to do it than someone who perhaps does not possess the DV expertise. Around 2013, we also had the creation of a diversion program, that is to say diverting folks from shelter or attempting to divert them from the system. And this was, again, another great opportunity for us to kind of show up to the table in terms of like that homelessness table, I'm going to call it, and say, hey, we can work with our housing authority to help survivors escape homelessness or move into, say, stable housing. And then lastly, one of the cool things that we did early on was to implement what now a lot of programs are doing, which is the housing first model for DV survivors. We were kind of, want to say, the pioneers in a little bit of a way with that. And I'm going to call someone out in the room. Chris Billhart, who is actually the director that we're referencing in this slide, was one of the proponents of doing the housing first model. And it's just one of those interesting things, again, about coming to the table where, you know, we are showing what best practices are when serving survivors. And that's not just something that you would apply to the work that we do with survivors, but to the work that we do with any participants engaging in any kind of social service. So again, we were able to come to the table and say, we've done this work. We know how to do it. Please let us have more voice at that table and give us some funding to reflect that knowledge. So now I will pass it along to Martha, who will talk about how we all came together.
Thanks, Maria. So first, just thinking about the resources that we were working with when we were first dealing with coordinated access. Some were HUD resources. We did have HUD COC grant, but many of the resources that we had were not HUD. We had 75 shelter beds. We had resources within dedicated culturally specific and mainstream programs who knew that housing was super important to survivors and were cobbling together different resources to help them. As Maria mentioned, we had experience with a lead agency running a collaborative pool of money to provide housing services, though it was not evenly accessed and the resources were not evenly spread. So different agencies had greater access to resources than other agencies. So when we started this conversation about these resources, we could have limited our conversation to the HUD funding and the resources that were HUD, but we really saw it as an opportunity to see if we could coordinate actually our access to even out access to resources for all survivors in the different agencies. So in 2014, we put together about 10 different people in a room to start really talking about what our system could look like. There was a series of meetings actually before this bullet is referring to, but they were fairly brief and only landed us on the decision that we wanted to have a multi-door access to coordinated access. That's as far as we got. So we thought, well, we know we want a multi-door access, so we'll come up with a tool that will work for everybody to do the assessment, and that's going to be easy. So this group that gets together in 2014, we think we're going to have a series of about 4 meetings. And it turned into like 30 meetings over a year or something. But our initial process, we really tried to explore our fears and concerns. There was a lot of trepidation about doing an assessment process for domestic violence survivors. A lot of concern that this could harm people, and so the members of this group, we really put those fears out there. We actually laminated those words onto clouds. Onto fire. We also shared our hopes and our aspirations, and those were laminated onto cloud shapes. And we had those on the table with us almost all the time that we were working. So just keeping alive that kind of sense of what we could do if we could reach a vision, and also that this was scary to implement so much change. Like I said, we even had to wrestle with, is assessment okay? We had some leadership in the area of doing assessment for domestic violence survivors, and some voices at the table saying that survivors had been okay with the process. They felt supported by the process of assessment, so that was helpful. Again, that comes out of Chris's agency. But the tools, when we examined the tools, I guess I should say that we, doing survivor-centered work, survivor-driven work is such a closely held value for all domestic violence providers that you have to kind of find a place to hold what it means to use your expertise when you're working alongside a survivor. And where we finally sort of said we have to stand is we have information that they don't have, and they want the information from us, and it's okay for us to ask a series of questions to ensure that we're providing the information that's the most germane to their situation. And then obviously, at the end of that process, everything would still be survivor choice and survivor-driven. So I'd already mentioned that we decided on using a multi-door process. We were early funders of a lot of culturally specific services, and we really wanted to build a system that was going to work very well for them. So we reviewed a lot of existing assessments and rejected them all. I think that the one that probably for us, the VI SPDAT just didn't deal with domestic violence vulnerability at all. Anything that was trying to assess vulnerability that was not specific to survivors made no sense to us. It just was not how we thought about vulnerability when we thought about survivors. And we were challenging ourselves to think about, like, what are the kinds of situations that make the hair stand up on the back of your neck? Like, we are the experts in this work. We know this. And the kind of questions that those tools were asking were not getting at the things that we knew were really scary. The tool that stayed in play the longest was the Jackie Campbell lethality assessment, which obviously a tool that has great respect in our community. It's a validated tool. And there was pretty strong voices for this could stand as our vulnerability tool. But what happened was there were equally strong and eventually prevailing voices that believed if we relied on the lethality assessment, that while we would serve people who were in a lot of danger, that we would miss other survivors that, while maybe not at high risk for homicide, were in harm's way. And we really wanted the opportunity to use our expertise to serve those survivors, even if they didn't score high on a lethality assessment. So when we finally set that down, we realized we have to write our own tool. And so that's when we really got down to this business of creating what is now called the Safety Stabilization Assessment, which I think is now Abby. Is that right?
Yeah. So as Martha said, we created this tool called the Safety and Stabilization Assessment with about with a lot of folks in the room. But before we launched it, we wanted to get all the rest of the leadership from other agencies in the room. And so we all met and showed them the tool, and we talked about it. I think we met maybe more than just once, a couple times at least, about the tool. And we got feedback from those other people so that we could make sure that we were being inclusive. And then we also got feedback from the co-director of Trauma Informed Oregon. And we made a couple changes. And then in January of 2015, we had our first training of this new tool. And we had about 80 advocates in the room to train them on how to use this thing that we're calling the Safety and Stabilization Assessment. And it was definitely a very interesting training. We had a lot of people in the room that were pretty skeptical, and, we're sitting them all down and saying, listen, from now on moving forward, if we're doing anything housing with survivors that are coming in to see us, whether that's shelter, eviction prevention, short-term rent assistance, long-term rent assistance, we are all going to run this tool. And we did it. We had this training, and at the end we had 80 advocates ready to go out and run this tool, and we started doing it. So like I said, we now use the Safety and Stabilization Assessment for any person that comes in seeking domestic violence services that is looking specifically for housing. So that is any housing that is within our system: motel vouchers, shelter, short-term housing, eviction prevention, relocation, long-term housing, permanent supportive housing, any kind of housing that we have, we run this tool. And this is not to say that when somebody comes in looking for other things, we don't also provide those things, but this is just for housing services. So we also, when we have intakes with folks, we're talking to them about other services, of course, that DV programs provide, support groups, long-term case management, all of those kinds of things. But this assessment specifically is for housing. Okay. So using the information that we collect in what we call the SSA, the advocate is going to work with the survivor to figure out what is their best step moving forward as far as housing or safe shelter. So as I went through before, there's several different options. We can be assessing for DV shelter, agency-based decisions, which are short-term housing decisions, which can be anything from eviction prevention to relocation, different kinds of diversion opportunities that we might find within the SSA. Maybe that survivor can go live with family. Maybe truly that survivor needs to relocate to a different state. Any of those kinds of things, we're assessing for that in the SSA. We're also looking for opportunities to house people that might need longer-term housing, so longer than 6 months up to anything from permanent supportive, anything in the permanent supportive housing realm, which we broker those opportunities through something that we call our resource coordination team, which Martha's going to talk about in just a second. So, and then we also assess for if this person might be better suited to be worked with in a different housing provider setting. So most of our housing interventions we've agreed upon, this person has to have been experiencing violence in the last 6 months, and anything beyond that we've determined is better suited for working in our other housing services systems that Maria described earlier. So one of the main things that we're looking for in the safety and stabilization assessment is something that we call Advocacy Opportunities scores. So this is really getting at the fact that when we're working with DV survivors who are fleeing, they're often dealing with a lot of complicated systems all at once, and folks with domestic violence expertise are really the folks who are best suited to be working with these people. So survivors are often involved in a lot of different complex systems that they're trying to navigate, whether that's child welfare, law enforcement, immigration, other court systems. They're dealing with a lot of different circumstances, and DV advocates are really well-trained to deal with this in a more survivor-centered and trauma-informed way. So what DV Advocacy Opportunities stand for is basically what specific skills, knowledge, and expertise do DV advocates have to support the survivor in locating and maintaining their housing. What this looks like, there's several different domains that we're looking for when we're assessing for advocacy opportunity scores. So the list is in front of you, but that can be anything from housing. So in housing, are we going to have to talk with landlords about what their rental history might look like because of domestic violence? Do they have property damage? Do they have evictions? Do they have unpaid rent? Any of those kinds of things that center around their domestic violence that we're going to be needing to write accommodation letters for and things like that. Do they have criminal justice involvement because of domestic violence that we're going to need to be working with them to get through? Do they have educational goals where we can be helping them access scholarships and different financial assistance opportunities that are available for domestic violence survivors? Do they have gaps in their employment due to domestic violence? All of these kinds of things that we can be advocating for them around while they're trying to seek housing and while they're trying to maintain housing. All things that domestic violence advocates are equipped and trained to do. So the list kind of goes on, and you can see what they are. Child welfare involvement, civil or immigration legal issues, cultural and community needs, legal issues. Do they need access to trauma services, healthcare services that we know in our community what's available for them, and we're going to be able to help them access. And Martha's now going to talk about the resource coordination team.
Yeah, so Abby mentioned that we have something called agency-based services, and those are in contrast to what we think of as resource coordination team services. So agency-based services are the interventions that can be accomplished in 6 months or less. And the reason that we call those agency-based is because it was really important to us to leave as much flexibility in the individual agencies as possible. And if somebody believes that really, truly the best service for this person, this survivor, is eviction prevention, we didn't want them to have to turn to a different agency to get it if possible. We wanted them to be able to make that decision, provide that eviction prevention, and move on. But when we got to our more precious, longer-term resources, and again, these are unevenly spread when we're building this system and continue actually to be, different agencies have different amount of longer-term services. Those services, we wanted to decide who would get the service. Sorry, I'm getting a note passed to me. I'm reacting to. I apologize. So these are services that we decided we wanted to broker together. I would say that the decision to broker as a panel was a community-wide decision. The directors made that decision. That was not done at the collaborative program manager level. It was a director decision to broker as a panel. But what that ended up meaning is that we all had to come together We landed on a twice monthly meeting, and it's called the Resource Coordination Team. We use RCT for shorthand a lot. The RCT rotates around to different agencies. So there's often this sort of, where's the RCT this week? And it's facilitated by one of the people at the organization that's hosting. And how it works is we find out about what openings will be brokered the week before the RCT meets. It's not a very sophisticated system how we broadcast openings, but it's what we have for now, which is we get an email that says, I am bringing a HUD spot for a HOH, head of household, +2. Sometimes it's a bigger one, and often that would have to do with it has to do with sometimes the case manager's capacity, sometimes it's the amount of money that the agency is looking to spend in this particular intervention as they've planned out for how they're going to manage their program services. But in any case, the agency bringing the opening describes the opening to the community, and the community then looks at the survivors that it's currently hoping to house. So basically somebody in each agency is looking at all their SSAs to find the SSAs that seem to match this particular opening, that would be good referrals for this opening. The typical practice in all of our agencies at that point is a phone call to the survivor to say, it looks like you might be a potential match. We're very cautious when we're talking to survivors, but we want to do a touch base with them. We've already obtained a release of information. There's nothing that would legally necessarily prevent us, but we always do a touch base before, saying, are you interested in us are you interested in being considered for this opening at the RCT? If the survivor says yes, then their information would be shared with the group at the RCT, there's a wide variety of numbers of referrals for openings. So sometimes we might have an opening that would have 16 referrals being considered for the one opening. That's not unusual, 12, 16. When you get up to 20, it gets very difficult. It's an emotional room to be in for sure. But sometimes we will have 4 or 5 for each opening. So for example, if the opening is a 12 to 24 month HUD spot for, let's say, an HOH +3 and comes with a Spanish-speaking Latinx-specific case manager, that's all going to be described. The facilitator of the meeting, after going over some ground rules, which I can share with you, would say, well, let me just back up. I'll just tell you what the ground rules are. This gets said every time that we go into the RCT. Everybody we are talking about is a survivor of domestic violence. We would serve every one of these individuals if we could, if we had the resources to serve them. We do not need, in most cases, almost all, to share the nature or circumstances of the abuse that they suffered. They've already been assessed as being good candidates for domestic violence services, and they could benefit from the help of a domestic violence advocate in an ongoing way around their housing. That's already happened. We ask that you take off your agency hat and you be here as a domestic violence expert and think about this community of survivors as being equally deserving regardless of which door they walked in. We hold each other in his best intentions. This work actually doesn't have any right or wrong answers. It's a work that used to be done individually within agencies. We now do it as a community, but we're still just making our best guess at the right thing. We know we are charged in this space with assessing who is the most vulnerable survivor, and that we're trying to affirmatively further fair housing for traditionally underserved or marginalized communities. I think that's all the ground rules. I'm looking around at my colleagues. That's basically what we say. And we say it at the beginning of every meeting just to affirm. Oh, there's the one more about sort of acknowledging that what we're about to do and putting a poster up to talk about somebody can feel kind of cold. We know that survivors are human beings, and that this is the best that we've been able to come up with, that we would like it to be as humanized as possible, but that's what we have. So then the opening gets described. We describe which opening we're going to broker first. We often are working with 3, 4, sometimes 5 openings. And so let's go back to my example of, say, the opening is it's a HUD spot for a family with a Spanish-speaking Latinx-specific case manager, and who's got referrals that are, so the first referrals that we would take for that opening would be folks, survivors that could culturally benefit from that case management, that specific case management, whose advocacy opportunity scores are at 8 or higher. And then we listen to those. We ask the person bringing the referral to describe the survivor's circumstances. The poster is like it's a canned poster. It's a pre-produced poster that gets filled in. It includes household size, cultural needs. It includes some employment history, household history, the kinds of things we need to understand about how ready this person is to be housed or not, again, depending on what the opening is. There's a lot of specifics, but we ask the person bringing the referral to talk about it themselves. Then we ask if anybody has any questions, and that happens. Often in the does anybody have any questions, there is a brainstorming component that goes on that has become very important in our community, because whether or not that survivor gets matched with that opening, they have just had 8 to 10 to 12 of the best thinkers in our community collectively think about how we could support their circumstances. And often the advice that gets carried back is really helpful even when a match doesn't happen. So that's a really powerful part about being together, thinking about survivors together. So then we go to decreasing advocacy opportunity scores, and then we would move into folks who would be from traditionally marginalized communities, but not necessarily would benefit from that specific type of case management, and then we do all the rest. And then we have this discussion that goes, who are you worried about? Who's making you feel nervous and upset? Now, remember, we have the advocacy opportunity scores that are higher, so the people who've gotten the most complicated, the most domains of their lives have been complicated by the domestic violence, are already sort of at the top of the list. But there's a process of people saying, I really think this is the best person for the service, and then they make a case. And then somebody else might make a case for somebody else, and somebody else might make a case for somebody else. And then there's this sort of exchanges that go on. And then slowly we start to move towards somebody as a group. We typically do a pulse check. We'll say, how are people feeling? Once we get down to 2 or 3, how many people are thinking about this one and that one? And slowly we will end up with consensus. We don't rush that process because we understand how important the work is that we are doing. And the meeting generally lasts from 2 to 4 p.m. in the afternoon, but we have leeway to go till 5 o'clock in case we need it to get through the opening. We've had a little bit of development of facilitation skills over time. So I was the facilitator when we were first piloting. And so then, but we have more facilitators now, and it's a tough meeting to facilitate. We're actually going to do an advanced RCT facilitator training in the coming months to try to embed both more leadership opportunities and just more kind of strength into that facilitation. But it's been, while it's hard work, we are all grateful that we get to do it together. When the survivor has been selected for the opening, it is very, very frequently a survivor from a different agency than brought the opening. So then there's this process and procedure of the connection that happens between the agency bringing the survivor and the agency accepting them for their housing placement and ongoing advocacy services. Our best practice on that is a post-RCT pre-placement meeting between the two people, that there would be a warm handoff, hopefully with the survivor, and co-advocacy agreements are made and who's doing what, so that there's a lot of clarity and a lot of sense that this survivor is going to get picked up for this service. It really, you know, it makes our work very visible to each other, both our work that we have done prior with a survivor to the RCT and then after with a survivor to the RCT. And at first that made people really nervous, and they felt very exposed. They felt like they were open to criticism from partner agencies about the work that they had done. But ultimately and currently, it has led to a tremendous and beautiful sense of community where people really feel like if I have a question, I have a lot of people I can ask that question of, and that we have really instilled a community-wide value in we are all doing our best. We are all trying hard. We are all coming from places of compassion and concern, and we will make mistakes, and we don't point fingers at each other around those things. We just offer community opportunities for improvement.
Wonderful. So now I'm going to talk a little bit of where we are now, and Martha has done a great job at explaining what coordinated access looks like, but it's important to note that it's ever-changing. I mean, we're constantly working on improving our coordinated entry process and improving our tool to help better assess vulnerability and better assess what the barriers and the strengths are of survivors in need of housing. And so we've gone through a couple of iterations of the tool, and we've discussed like drafting a manual of what all of coordinated access would look like, but a manual that would explain what your role would be like as a facilitator. And every time we even enter those conversations, we just recognize that it's still changing, it's still fluid, and we're still trying to get it to the best place that we can before we say, this is how we're going to move forward from now on. That being said, as Martha described, it has created a great sense of community, and we've seen an increase in the level of referrals happening across agencies, in part naturally due to the coordinated entry process, but as well in terms of just co-advocacy amongst advocates providing services to a participant. And it's just, excuse me, it's really brought us together and really kind of demonstrated how the system is a unified force that can then be a source of knowledge for other providers. And I reference that specifically in terms of how what we're doing now is really trying to focus more on working with the other subpopulations and the other systems in the work that we do, not necessarily combining them, because we know that wouldn't necessarily be the right course of action, but still working with these populations to better be able to serve all the participants that we see come through our doors, or perhaps survivors who are accessing services outside of our system but would be better served within our system. So we are working on really strengthening not only those relationships within our DV system, but our DV system in collaboration with the rest of the homeless service providers. And so some of the work that we're doing now kind of in line with that is working to really have a really solid plan on like emergency transfers and what would that look like, not just for folks, again, in our system, but for folks receiving services in any other homeless service provider agency and needing to get transferred into a safe, stable unit. So again, folks looking to us to say, help us lead this work, even though this impacts all of us. So yeah, for the most part, our coordinated entry process is running, a tool is being used, and we're still working on improving it. We're talking now about essentially expanding the tool so that it can be used during after hours for survivors in crisis needing to get into shelter when, it's after 5 over the weekend, for example. And yeah, just kind of reassessing things as we go. One really great thing that I think that we have that has allowed us to continue this work and continue improving it has been to have these ongoing monthly meetings where all of the representatives, or at least a representative from each of these agencies that comprises coordinated access for the DV system, comes together and meets to talk about all things coordinated access, to talk about revisiting the tool, to talk about how we are prioritizing folks. So discussing whether or not advocacy opportunities scores is the perfect way of doing this. Excuse me. Oh my goodness, I was just going to say something. Talk about the tool. Oh, and so one really cool thing that we did, and Martha and I did this in collaboration with Faye Schuler, who's another service provider, is that we decided to do interviews with each and every single one of the agencies that comprises coordinated access, not just with like the management staff, but with the advocates who are doing the direct level work, to assess as a whole, what are our gaps, what are our strengths, what are we doing well, and what could be better, and really just kind of embracing a certain level of discomfort, right? Because we want to think like we're doing this right, we're moving forward, we're helping survivors, but also being able to look back and say, okay, we've had these things running, what is working and what could be better? And so again, this just shows kind of the level of commitment and the level of advocacy coming on behalf of these providers, and just kind of our dedication to keep improving, and to just let you all know that it's been a rocky and great road this entire time, and it hasn't been easy, and folks were really scared to think, I have to share my agency resources with everyone else. What will that mean for the folks that we're currently serving when we already don't have enough resources? But with what all of this work has done is to, again, kind of put us in the same playing field and help us recognize that we're here for survivors. And the way to get around that is for all of us to come together and figuring out what we can do better, and moving forward with that, and recognizing that there's no wrong door. And we want to make sure that if a Spanish-speaking survivor shows up at a mainstream agency, that person, due to the work that we've done and due to coordinated access, can get that level of advocacy in terms of housing that they need, with the right, the language that they speak, with the cultural components that they possess, and so on.
And I would just add to that, Maria,
Totally.
that when somebody's feeling like, well, wait a second, I don't have enough resources for the survivors that are coming in my door.
Mm-hmm.
How is this going to work if I'm trying to share with others? It's great to remind them that you also get to share all of theirs.
Right, totally.
Your survivors potentially could benefit from the other 13 agencies' resources when it's a good fit for them, and it makes sense. And I guess I would also add that we have struggled as a system to be able to describe the entirety of the need that we are seeing. We have counted calls to crisis lines, which we know sometimes is a duplicated number, certain requests for service, but we know, and we're still evolving this, but if we can really accurately track our SSA data, then we will actually be able to describe for those survivors that we were able to assess what the whole need is. If our system were fully funded or had access to the depth of housing services that was really needed, we could count that number, because we keep great data on the housing interventions that we provide, but that's for the survivors that got a housing intervention. We want to be able to talk about the survivors that we met, that we worked with, that we wanted to serve, but we couldn't, so that we can really go to policymakers and say, this is what we would need if we had our whole system funded.
All right, so we're going on to lessons learned. So this has been an ongoing learning process for us. And really one of the things that I think about when I come back to think about coordinated access is that it is rooted in relationships. That's where all of this starts, is relationships between service providers, between advocates, between service systems. And part of what we have done is really develop a much closer relationship with our homeless service providers. And frank and transparent conversations are necessary to really move this work and get it to going to the place where survivors can really access the housing services that are in the community. we did a 3-day training with the homeless service system about domestic violence in general, which really strengthened the relationships between the systems. I can remember there were, that first day, as some of the homeless case managers, homeless service system case managers were walking in, and, I overheard a lot of them talking about they know about domestic violence, they don't really need this training. And 3 days later, we all learned a lot from each other. It was really a pretty amazing couple of days. Do any of you have any lessons learned to share?
I would just keep, I know that I keep mentioning over and over again, but really it's showing up to the table even when you think you're not wanted. And even maybe you're not wanted at that table, but still show up and make yourself be known. Because, we've seen over the course of the last 5 years, we went from, we were a solid system, but definitely not elevated or recognized. And you could see that with the funding. And so you move 5 years later, after the creation of a home for everyone and the creation of the joint office. And when the state of housing emergency came up, there were investments that were specifically targeted to the domestic violence housing system. And I just think that, maybe we still would have gotten some of that funding, but perhaps it would have been less had it not been for that fierce advocacy coming from the system and saying, like, we can do this work. And so I just, if you were to compare today from 5 years from now, which is not really that long ago, the system has increased so much in the level of resources that are now being given to us. And again, that wouldn't have been done had we not shimmied our way to the front of the line. And I know it kind of sounds silly, but it really is, and I don't mean to bash in any way the work being done outside of our system, but like Maria said, sometimes folks make the assumption that, I do housing and I've served survivors in the past, so therefore I can do both together. But we know that that's not the case. You really need the expertise on both sides of it, because violence and your experience with housing, education, mental health, all of these different categories all intersect, and it's only an DV advocate who can be really suited and well placed to offer those services. So I will say it one more time in case folks didn't hear me. Show up to the table, and eventually I think you'll be heard. And at least for our case, it was after showing up that many times that they were like, okay, we get this, and how do we institutionalize this now, and having you be a part of the system and having that stick. And I think that one of the other reasons that not just showing up to the table, but the fact that we had developed our coordinated access process and became a unified force showed them, like, we're ready to do this, and we're doing housing already, so plop us in there. Okay, now I'm done.
I'll just talk a little bit about that last point there, the shelter to stability. One of the things that we wanted to do with this coordinated access process, there had been a belief and, often a pathway to housing resources was going through shelter, domestic violence shelter, which doesn't always serve survivors best. Survivors who don't need shelter and need housing don't need to go to the domestic violence shelter. And folks who go to the shelter don't always need housing. They weren't the same thing. So part of what we were trying to do was really better assess people and help folks get the resources that they need. So what we did, as some of those housing resources were spreading out to the community, we shored up some of the housing support in the shelters with something that we call Shelter-Stabilization, which is really about debt reduction and helping folks with whatever they need while they're in the shelter become ready to be housed by the time that they leave.
I was going to add that I didn't quite realize when I came in as a facilitator really with no housing expertise at all. And now that I have a broader picture, I realized how important it was that we had the autonomy to define vulnerability ourselves for survivors. And when I think about the jurisdictions that don't have direct access to housing resources and are expected to refer survivors to other housing systems and have them use their vulnerability assessments, I really worry, because I haven't seen yet effective vulnerability assessments that work for survivors that are not survivor specific. So I think if you're in a jurisdiction that's saying we want to serve survivors, we want to prioritize service to survivors, that there's really, I hope that there will be a thought of peeling off a percentage of the resources and letting the domestic violence organizations choose who would get those resources outside of a different system. That was the privilege that we had because of leadership that was here before, getting housing resources that were specific for survivors. So I really think the way we think about vulnerability, the way other systems think about vulnerability is not going to be effective for raising most survivors into priority groups.
I think we might have some questions. Is that, how do we?
Yeah, so this is Debbie, and I'm not sure how you want to proceed. If you guys want to look at the questions and respond, or we can call them out and you all can answer them. There's and make sure to read them out loud because not everybody's following the chat closely. So do you guys just want to read them and respond? Pick a few.
Debbie, this is Chris. I've been tracking the questions, and I can just put them out there and have the group respond if that works.
Works for me.
That works. Go for it. Thank you.
Sure. So first, we wanted to just clarify, and maybe one of you can speak to this, that this is a parallel domestic violence coordinated entry system that you all have developed here. This is not integrated into the larger COC.
Yeah, that is true. When the joint office was created, as Maria said, because we already had some housing resources in our DV system and because we kept showing up, we just continued down the path that we were on using our own parallel system. The DV providers in Multnomah County do not use HMIS. They each have access to a comparable database that has all of the HUD required data elements for any housing programs, and they have been using that for a while, and so we continued with that. We do not use HMIS, and we don't track. We don't use HMIS at all. I just lost what I was going to say.
It's definitely a parallel system, and yeah, I mean, there's some bridges to other systems. We have very good working relationships with the other systems. Like, obviously, state survivors are showing up in all of the systems. Right. Our expertise was everywhere, but for the housing specific, it's definitely parallel. And frankly, our local policymakers saw no reason to get us out of the business. We're having a housing crisis. We all needed to be in this business. So, yeah, that's parallel.
So what we have now, so kind of in short, is that we have 4 separate, although they do speak to one another, but 4 separate coordinated entry processes for each of our subpopulations. So one for youth, one for families with children, one for single adults without children, and then our domestic violence coordinated entry process that we've described today.
And that is one of the next things that we will be working on, that the Joint Office is working on now, is how to coordinate those separate parallel systems. And we're standing at the table ready to participate in the ways that we can.
There were lots of questions about the SSA.
Yes.
Many requests for copies of the SSA.
Yeah, we can share that with
you all
them.
Can speak to that, and some specifics around the SSA. How does it address survivor strengths? And what happens, is there a different assessment process if the person is in crisis?
Yeah, thank you. Want me to go?
Yeah.
Yeah, they're actually, so I know that Abby said we use SSA for motel vouchers and for shelter access. We actually have two kinds of motel vouchers that we think of conceptually in our system. One we think of as bridge vouchers, which are vouchers that are helping us get somebody from a point in time to a different intervention. They can be a week or 2 weeks or sometimes even 3 weeks long. But we also have crisis vouchers. SSAs are not required for crisis voucher access. So if we are talking to somebody on the phone or we are meeting somebody in person and we realize that what this person needs is safety and sleep and food and the basic needs that somebody would need to move out of a crisis state, we would not be asking them to participate in an assessment. Our SSAs have been used for shelter access. That has slowed down some of our overnight access to shelter, which was our #1 priority problem coming out of our evaluation. And so we now have, we're piloting a bifurcated tool that is a shorter, streamlined assessment for after-hours access when a bed is actually open, and is also available for some of our folks that work at night, like our response advocates that are out with police and things like that. You know, you can't really do an assessment if you're really, really in crisis. Right. So we move a person out of crisis before we ask them to do an assessment. There's lots of questions about strengths because we really care about survivor strengths. So we are honing in on positive rental histories, positive employment histories, you know, ways that they've been creative in how they've taken care of themselves and access services and stuff. So yeah, all the domains have strengths-based questions in the domains.
Okay. Somebody had a question about how the diversion program works.
Anybody? Well, one of our agencies that had a shelter at, and this is before my time, but closed the shelter, and we had some innovative thinkers in our office who realized this was an opportunity to pilot a diversion program, that if survivors don't need shelter, how else can we help them attain safe and stable housing? So our diversion program has advocates sited at the Gateway Center, which is our DV drop-in center, and also at Home Forward, our housing authority. And at Home Forward, the advocate primarily works with folks who are in public housing and at risk of losing that housing because of domestic violence. They do things like bifurcate leases and all kinds of other, what was that? Move units if necessary. Martha, do you want to talk about the diversion program at the Gateway Center?
Sure.
Is that really
yeah.
in your wheelhouse?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was kind of parallel in some ways to the development of coordinated access. At the Gateway Center, we were figuring out how we could figure out if somebody could benefit safely from a real short-term intervention, so an eviction prevention, a move-in rent. We have a local grant administered by the state that folks can access, but it doesn't come with any placement or advocacy services, so often they would be using that grant and some other funds. So in the context of coordinated access, what we had thought of as diversion became agency-based assistance. So if somebody comes into the Gateway Center and says, I'm looking for a housing change, or I'm unsafe in my housing situation, or I need support with housing, there would be an advocate who would run an SSA. If that SSA reveals like a situation where, you know, this survivor is not a historical help seeker, they have really done a great job in maintaining their own housing, but due to a separation, they have a drained bank account and some recent employment strain, and that if we do a sort of really pointed investment for this person right now, we can maybe protect their housing or get them into a placement and get them stabilized so that we're minimizing the impact of that separation. And we think of that as diversion because historically, if we didn't have access to those types of things, we would often be having to route somebody into shelter. We did have Housing First here first, so, you know, but there was still this concept of this might have been a person who would have ended up in a shelter if we didn't have access to these flexible funds and an ability to think more creatively about their scenario or their situation.
Okay, that's great. So some questions about the RCT process and how it works. First of all, how does information about openings come forward? And how does survivor confidentiality work when their referrals are being considered?
So, sure. So the openings are shared just through email. Like Martha mentioned this at one point. When an opening comes up, which usually means an advocate has capacity to take on a new survivor, an email will just go out to the group and say, at the next RCT, NAYA is bringing an opening for a household with probably a couple of dependents, and that usually is around like the amount of rent that they'll be able to pay. So that's shared fairly informally. The information in ISSE RCT, we use something that we call a heart hook, which is basically just a shorthand way to talk about someone without using any specific, because like Martha said, we'll have sometimes 10 survivors that we're considering, and we don't want to refer to them as that SS, we want to personalize them. So the advocate...
But we don't use their names.
Don't use their names.
Or their birth dates or anything else that would be immediately identifiable.
I mean, it might be something like when, the first time the advocate met with them, they were drinking a strawberry shake. And so we might call that person Strawberry Shake. Just to be able to talk about that individual without any identifying information.
And we also have an ROI that participants fill out. As Martha said, when we meet with them and we're talking about options, if it comes up that it seems that they're going to need a longer-term housing intervention, we talk to them about the RCT, and we talk about, at my agency anyway, we basically show them the poster and what we would be presenting about them at the RCT. We let them know what agencies are at the RCT, which is essentially all of us, and then they sign an ROI that they're okay with that information being shared in a group setting. And we have had cases where, they didn't want a certain agency to hear that information, and we'll excuse that agency for when we're sharing about this particular family.
I'll also add really quick, in terms of sharing information, it's kind of hard to know what it actually looks like until you're in the room. But one thing that I would like to point is that when we first started doing this matching process during our RCTs, we used to, when we're talking about the participant, you not naturally talk about what their experience has been. And so way at the beginning, we would go into detail about, what is their history of abuse and what are all of these other components impacting their housing or their safety or their stability. And even in those conversations, even though we had ROIs in place and even though we had a confidentiality agreement that is signed by all of the providers in that room at each of those RCT meetings, based on the information, you can still pick up who that might be. But now we've moved away from really kind of displaying the ins and outs of or the abuse that the person has experienced, because really we recognize that all of these folks are survivors, and it's really hard to kind of be listening to that information 20 cases in, So we kind of walked away from that, and that's also helped a little bit in terms of not relaying too much information that would help you kind of in a backhanded way identify that person. And so what we don't even do, even though we might be like, oh, I know who that advocate or that participant is, we won't say that. We won't be like, oh, I know who you're talking about. We make it a pretty, we make it a point to not disclose personal identifying information or any information that might even get you close to being able to identify that person. And then on top of that, we take all of the precautions necessary to meet VAWA compliance around confidentiality.
Somebody asked, what happens to survivors who don't get placed during the RCT process?
So sometimes an idea has been floated by somebody else at the RCT that works to almost divert that person from the RCT. Sometimes we'll be able to access a different resource. No, there are no limits. We have not agreed on any limits to how many times a person can show back up to the RCT. We leave that to the individual agencies. As a community, we are starting to wrestle with a process, a place for what if survivors refer to the RCT 4 times, 5 times, there was an opening that they were referred for. Because sometimes you're waiting for an RCT to have the right opening show up. But say they were actually on the wall being considered 5 times and they were never selected. Do we have a place where we can come back together and say what is going on, what don't we have, why is this person not rising? So as with every other domestic violence service, or any service is my guess, this is the one I work in, when we're not able to identify a resource after our best efforts, often, eventually, a survivor will move on. And that's painful for us, but it's something that we want to be able to track. It's actually asked very specifically in our SSA tracking system about was this person unable to identify a resource you believed they needed, and any other details about what happened so we can tell that story.
One thing that we've kind of tossed around as a potential idea and kind of as a way to get around the fact that, oftentimes those folks with higher advocacy opportunity scores might get selected given their circumstances, but a way to kind of meet the need, because, right, the resources are still scarce given the number of folks needing housing within our system, but kind of ways to go around that is to then say, an agency with the one advocate doing the housing work might have the option of bringing 2 openings. So perhaps we can bring in someone with a high advocacy opportunity score that would require a lot of support and a lot of service, and then perhaps bring someone who's shown up to RCT 3 times that perhaps has a lower advocacy opportunity score, and that would mean less of a capacity constraint on that advocate. And that way we can kind of even out the level of work that the advocate is doing. That's to say that they're not responding to 15 folks in high level of crisis, but rather have some that are higher and some that are lower, and that way try to, again, be able to support those folks who have shown up at RCT multiple times.
There's also a process of updating SSAs. So if you have not had contact with a survivor for 30 days, we're probably going to ask you to close that SSA. That's not an open SSA anymore. But if you are having ongoing contact with survivors, you're kind of updating the SSA all the time as their circumstances change. And so what might happen is somebody originally gets pushed for the RCT, then has a reconciliation with their sister, gets a new job. Now they're starting to look like they'd be a good fit for an agency-based intervention, and we can turn on a dime on an SSA like that. So for some folks, I think that's the other thing is, survivors' lives are not static, and so our system attempts to kind of have the SSAs not just be a point in time, but be a sort of ongoing and evolving reflection of the work that the survivor is doing and that the advocate is doing. And so, hopefully we're getting as many folks' needs met as possible.
And that kind of implies that advocates are staying in touch with the survivors that they've put forward.
That's right.
And so can any of you speak to what kind of information the survivor is getting as they go through that process?
Yeah, so we stay in contact. We basically keep our SSAs open until we find some resolution to, some kind of stability for that survivor, or we just lose complete contact with them. So every time that we take a survivor's information to RCT, at the end of I'm the person who attends us at the RCT for NAIA, and so at the end of the RCT, I will update the advocates about the folks that they sent forward, let them know either that they were selected or that they weren't selected. And if they weren't selected, I give feedback to the advocate about, what was discussed during the RCT and other options that might be available for that person, or things that we need to work on to make them, more ready for that specific placement that we put them up for, or whatever that is. And then that advocate carries it back to the survivor, and, lets them know either that they were selected and sets up that initial meeting with the other case manager, or lets them know, that they weren't selected this time, but these are some things that we can work on the meantime, and we'll be coming back in 2 weeks. And then we really just continue to work with them. And like Martha said, circumstances are always changing, and so by the time the next RCT comes up in 2 weeks, we might be working at a completely different housing intervention for that person. But we just continue to work with them just as we always have. We just continue to seek stability for that person and keep working on their goals, whatever those goals might be.
And safety always. Safety,
yeah.
Safety.
And during your presentation, you spoke to this some, but I wonder if there's anything more you can say about special considerations applied to traditionally marginalized communities, survivors from those communities?
Well, because we've anchored a number of our resources around the provision of culturally specific case management, we are often matching. So we've just resourced up those systems, recognizing particularly for monolingual survivors, non-English speaking monolingual survivors, that if we're really going to help with safety and stability, we need some certain types of services in place. So those case managers are attached to housing openings, and because we want the survivor who will most benefit from that type of specific service, we almost always are matching those survivors who could most benefit to those services, and that gets at it a lot. Also, I think just our general anti-oppression, anti-racism lens really helps us think about vulnerability for populations in a sophisticated way. Of the 4 housing systems that Maria Alvarez described, we serve far, far more people of color than the others do. So I know that between our sense of vulnerability and our ability to match to culturally specific services, that we're doing a great job serving traditionally underserved or marginalized populations.
And that was one of the big investments from the Joint Office. Our big ask from the DV community to the Joint Office when we learned that there would be some investments was to have a housing advocate, an FTE, and housing funds at each of our 5 culturally specific programs. And over the last 4 years, before coordinated access, we were serving about 75% people of color in our long-term housing programs, and that's actually shifted to about 90% now in this last year.
One thing that I'll add really quick in terms of these agencies that offer culturally specific services is that Abby had mentioned, and Martha as well earlier, that agencies have the capacity, depending on the kind of housing intervention program, to do agency-based decisions as well as RCT matching decisions. That distracted me. So for these culturally specific agencies that have housing advocates, they also have the opportunity to be able to, assuming that for example, with a Latinx organization, that Latinx participants are reaching out to them for services, and that agency then, depending on the level of intervention that the participant needs and is wanting, they can opt to do agency-based decisions that they are also overseeing and managing and help case manage. I hope that made sense. This is just to say that we're trying to reach folks, specifically folks of color, not just in the RCT level of things and in those matching processes, but that these agencies also have the autonomy to decide for themselves in terms of shorter housing intervention programs who they're serving, and in that capacity it makes sense that, based on the, whether it's bicultural services or that ability to speak in that participant's language, really kind of elevates those folks to be served at those places.
Can I circle back to an old question about the SSA? We talked about the strengths a little bit, but I'm not sure that people heard. One, so our SSA is actually going through an evolution right now. So what we have available to share is the previous tool that's been the most widely used tool, but I would like you to hear that it's evolving even as we speak. So we can share the February 2016 SSA so you can see what we're using. It has a whole page of questions that we call the imminence and access questions. And for the domestic violence experts out there, you'll see it looks quite a bit like a lethality assessment. But we do have some nuance to the questions, and we're really trying to evaluate if this person is in harm's way with those imminence and access questions. I just want to say that about the SSA before we go on.
Okay, great, thanks. And speaking of dedicated resources, there were some questions about whether there are dedicated resources for all the time that agencies spend doing this process, the RCT and meetings and all that.
No is the short answer. All of the work that we've kind of laid out today, or maybe not all of it, but all of the work that went into developing coordinated entry, developing the tool, drafting the tool, which I should say is like a 10-page document with some, it's hefty, I'll put it that way. And it took some time, and it took a bunch of reiterations, but this was all essentially donated time from all of these advocates and all of this management staff and members who were a part of the system. They essentially donated their time. And I should say donating their time while they're also doing crisis intervention work with the number of survivors coming into the system. So yes, that's the short answer, I guess. Martha, maybe you want to add something.
We have attempted to draw in and identify some resources that would alleviate some of that volunteering nature of the work. But so far, it's been sort of swallowed up into more housing interventions. Like our system is so dedicated to the survivors that we serve that if it's like, could I spend this money on, you know, sort of my FTE, or could I spend it to help a survivor? We just lean towards that survivor. So that's part of us trying to learn to be our healthiest selves as agencies and as organizations. And, you know, we have really reiterated very strongly over and over within this process that taking care of our advocates takes care of survivors. And that we have, when folks have tried to resource us in a way that we thought would overburden advocates, we have resisted and said that, you know, if we are burning one advocate out after another with the way that we do our work, we are not going to get ahead, in this system. So, but we haven't spent a lot of hours on this design.
Well, yeah, but I think part of it too is like we knew that we had to do this, and we were just all committed to making this happen, and ultimately it has tremendously benefited survivors, in my opinion. And so I think we all just made a commitment that we were going to make this happen, and we did, and so here we are.
Yeah, and I can think of things happening that are really concrete, like 2 providers of permanent housing came and said, we want to serve domestic violence survivors. Can you help us? They went to individual agencies. The individual agencies said, absolutely, we have a process for brokering those things. You know, we'll sign an MOU with you, but then those permanent apartments come to the RCT and get brokered at the RCT. So as systems have reached towards us, they just find us coordinated, and they're real happy because they can say, hey, look, I'm serving survivors, and we're happy because we're picking the survivors that they serve. So resources have flowed in, and in different ways that does make it easier.
Totally. I will say just around that volunteering time, I mean, I think part of this is that we had some leadership here in the DV system that saw this coming, like Abby said, and was just really clear that we could be proactive and rather than reactive, which is what we ultimately decided to do, that this time was going to be spent from people in our system, so we might as well start doing it and driving it the way that we want to go.
So Maria, you mentioned earlier that the work in connecting with the 4 systems within, making better connections within those systems is underway now. And so this might be future plans. But There were some questions about what happens if a survivor shows up at the larger COC. Does that person get diverted to the DV coordinated entry system? Do they do anything different or special about data and confidentiality? Just some questions about how that's working right now, or whether that might be future work that you're referring to from earlier.
So it's definitely a work in progress. We don't really at the moment have like a specific, I'll say, pipeline that connects all coordinated entry processes. But what we do have is, again, more of a kind of raised voice in the greater system. So folks do know, okay, someone with DV experience came through my doors, me as a non-victim service provider. I know that I can call to safety, which is the crisis line, or at the very least I know about Gateway Center, so I can send them there to connect them with services. So there is some work being done currently in terms of being better able to guide folks needing DV resources to the correct doors, but there is no set structure where, and there are questions in the VS-FDET that address domestic violence that would help you then be like, okay, this person is definitely better served by the DV system. I'm going to try to refer them that way. But it's not happening quite as we would. It's not as concrete as we would like to see it.
Although there is at the 2-on-1, which is the one door in for our homeless family system, we did at the very front end of this process embed a few questions at the beginning of if it's a family, well, it's families who call 2-on-1. There are a couple of questions that address domestic violence, and if the person on the phone would like to, answers yes to those questions, they're asked if they would like to be served by a DV agency.
Okay, thank you so much. We are almost out of time. Debbie, do you want to bring us home?
Yes, I will. Thank you all so much, everyone in Multnomah County, for sharing your innovative practices on coordinated entry. And so that does bring us to the end of our webinar. I want to thank everybody for your patience on joining the webinar. We had more than very unusual glitches today, and we will be sending out a recording. So on behalf of the National Network to End Domestic Violence and the DV and Housing Technical Assistance Consortium partners at Collaborative Solutions, the National Alliance for Safe Housing, and the National Resource Center on Domestic Violence, I'd like to thank everyone at Multnomah County for taking the time to share their practices and their parallel coordinated entry processes with all of us today. And I'd like to thank everyone who joined us on the webinar as well. We will send out the PowerPoint from today's webinar and the recording for you to reference, and please share it with your colleagues. You can also find it on the Safe Housing Partnerships website at safehousingpartnerships.org, where you will find additional resources on the intersection of DV and housing and homelessness. And thank you all again for participating, and have a great day.
The leader has disconnected. The conference will be terminated in 5 minutes. The leader has turned lecture off and your lines have been unmuted.